Thank you all for joining us for this web clinic today. So we're going to talk about tips for avoiding common errors and protocols for Cochrane Systematic Reviews. We're specifically focusing on reporting for reviews of intervention studies. So first, we'll spend a little time discussing why protocols are critical for enhancing the transparency and rigor of Cochrane reviews and provide some helpful resources. Then we'll talk about 4 different common errors seen during methods peer review by the quality assurance team. Finally, we'll provide a few suggestions and examples for reporting equity-related assessments and consumer involvement. So let's go ahead and dive in. Protocols are critical to increasing the transparency of methods for Cochrane reviews and help to minimize bias. Authors are required to plan critical aspects of the review ahead of its conduct, and during this process, authors will consider potential methodological challenges and make key decisions for strategies to address these challenges. Additionally, publication and peer review of protocols can strengthen transparency and rigor of the review methods and promote accountability. So, there are numerous resources available for authors when developing their protocols. For example, the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions has a section on protocol development and for reporting. Additionally, there's PRISMA reporting guidance specific to protocols of systematic reviews. And we also have Nasir's standard C1 through 23, which also provide guidance on various aspects authors should consider in conducting their reviews. But with all these resources, it's sometimes difficult to know where to look and what to look for. So to help with this and with consistent reporting of Cochrane protocols and reviews, Cochrane has an intervention review template. And what's great about the template is that it contains information and links to the resources on the previous slide. So, for example, it provides guidance aligned with the handbook, Messier, and Prisma all in one location. So authors can use it to ensure transparent and rigorous reporting. You can access the template in the RevMan knowledge base. If you click on the blue button above, you'll create your own copy of the template. Be sure to open the template as a practice review in RevMan so you'll have the latest versions. Updates or improvements to the template are announced via the Author Digest, which is a monthly newsletter for authors of Cochrane Reviews. So please be sure you're signed up to receive this newsletter. Also, did you know that you can view the checklists that Cochrane's quality assurance editors use when conducting methods peer review? These checklists are available for both protocols and reviews. So you can compare the reporting in your protocol with the checklist prior to submission. This may help with any protocol reporting issues before you submit and might help to shorten the peer review time. Now we'll get to the meat of the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Claire to discuss some of the common errors seen in protocols.
Thank you, Joanna. So, some of the errors we see at the review stage could have been prevented by clarifying and adding detail in the protocol. The first error we see involves unclear descriptions of interventions or comparators. I say that referring to Messier C7, that emphasizes to define in advance the eligible interventions and the comparators. Therefore, the protocol needs to report whether the experimental intervention is to be compared with an inactive control, such as placebo or no treatment, or with an active control. For example, a different variant of the same intervention or a different intervention. Authors should also report whether there's any restrictions on interventions and comparators in terms of the dosage or intensity of the intervention, the mode of delivery, the personnel who deliver it, the frequency, duration, or timing of delivery. Furthermore, Will studies including the intervention of interest combined with another intervention, such as a co-intervention, be included? Care should be taken to include studies that have the same co-intervention in each arm. This is an example from the Cochrane Review template that gives an idea about the level of detail required in this section of this review. Reporting, firstly, the broad intervention grouping, such as counselling interventions. Describing this grouping and following this by specific examples of the intervention, eligible ways of delivering the intervention, such as face-to-face or telephone, duration of the intervention, and describing who could deliver the intervention. Note that you don't have to put this information in a table. It can be presented narratively. The second common error is a lack of clarity around outcomes. Authors should clarify and justify in advance if outcomes are to be used as criteria for including studies. It can be a huge error to exclude studies because the outcomes of interest were not reported but still measured. If authors do exclude studies on the basis of outcomes, care should be taken to determine if relevant outcomes are not available because they have not been measured, rather than simply not reported. Also, if authors do decide to exclude studies based on outcomes reported, they need to provide rationale for doing this. Authors need to ensure that the eligible outcomes are selected and categorized as critical and important, including outcomes that measure benefits and harms and are most clinically meaningful to the decision maker. It's important to bear in mind that the most commonly reported outcomes may not be the most appropriate ones to answer your review question. Authors should look for any core outcome sets that exist in the evidence base and use those to help choose the most important and critical outcomes. In addition, authors need to describe the outcomes adequately. So authors need to report the outcome domain, which could be, say, depression, and then the eligible ways to measure these. For example, the Hamilton Depression Scale or other depression scales, along with the time point of follow-up. It may be difficult to provide an exact time point in advance, but authors should have an idea about which time frame is clinically meaningful to the research question and define the time frame of importance, for example, into short-term, medium-term, or long-term. When there's more than one measure for a given outcome domain in an included study, authors should consider prioritizing which measure they're going to use to provide a hierarchy of measures to avoid the possibility of selection bias and unit of analysis issues. So, for example, in one included study, there may be multiple scales of quality of life. Authors should consider which is the most important of these to include. Authors might be more interested in general quality of life versus disease-specific quality of life, or they may prefer objective versus subjective measures or validated over unvalidated measures. Such decisions will need to be carried forward to the outcomes prioritized at risk of bias and grade assessment and should be consistent across these sections of the protocol. This is an example from the template to illustrate some of these points. Here, 3 timeframes are of interest: short-term, immediate term, and longer term. Authors should define each timeframe as shown here. The guidance also reminds the authors to provide a hierarchy of outcomes to be reported when there's more than one outcome measure for an outcome domain within one study, as previously mentioned. The third common error looks at the reporting methods for assessing risk of bias. Reporting guidance for ROB is available in the Cochrane Review template. Firstly, in the protocol, it's important to specify who are the two people working independently in the risk of bias assessment, with a plan for resolving disagreements and for contacting trial authors for missing information needed to carry out these assessments. Secondly, authors should describe how ROB assessment is being carried out, which tool is being used, such as the ROB1, the ROB2, or Robin's Eye. Authors should describe the tool they'll be using in terms of its domains and cite the tool appropriately according to the version that they're using. The common error with the ROB1 is that people add or remove domains without any clear justification for doing so. Also, even though it's a study-based tool, it's likely that the different outcomes may need to be assessed differently, such as subjectively reported outcomes versus objectively reported ones, in relation to blinding of participants and outcome assessors. If they're doing this, they should report it. With the ROB2, a common error is seen when this tool is used as a study-based tool, as opposed to an outcome-based one. It's important that each outcome should be assessed using this tool. Furthermore, with the ROB2, authors need to report which outcomes and what time points or time frames of outcome follow-up are the most important. It's not necessary to assess all outcomes and time points for ROB, but it is necessary to assess all those outcomes that are to be assessed using grade, as ROB2 overall judgments feed into grade. And finally, when non-randomized studies are included, authors often don't report the methods they plan to use for assessing the ROB, and they should report these methods in similar detail to those methods reported for the Cochrane risk of bias tools. Here are some resources which contain detailed guidance for various risk of bias tools. If you're using ROB1, please refer to the older version of the Cochrane Handbook, version 5.2, 2017. The final common error stems from Messier C15, which states to describe any methods used to assess certainty or the confidence in the findings of the review for an outcome. So one red flag error we come across is when authors don't provide any methods for assessing certainty in the body of evidence for an outcome. It's important for authors to state who will assess grade. Are there two people working independently to assess the certainty of the findings in the review, with a plan for resolving disagreements? And how is it being carried out? Are grade considerations clearly described in terms of the 5 grade domains? And is grade appropriately referenced? Most importantly, authors should address what are the comparisons, outcomes, and time points or time frames being prioritized in the SOF tables. Authors should provide a clear plan to present only the most important comparisons, outcome measures, and time points in the SOF table, ensuring one table per comparison, making sure that outcomes are consistently worded between the sections of the protocol, and that at least one adverse effect is included to provide a balanced review of benefits and harms. Here are some resources to help with planning and creating SOF tables. There's a tutorial on how to present an informative summary of findings table for systematic reviews of interventions from the Cochrane Evidence Synthesis and Methods Journal by Hilgart, Miles and Chase 2024. And in the RevBAM template, there's a section to guide authors. It's important to ensure that all critical outcomes in the review are presented in this table. And now I'm going to pass you back to Joanna to talk about 2 new areas in the focus review format.
Hey, thanks, Claire. Let's see here. Go back. Next, we'd like to share some resources and examples of reporting equity-related assessments and consumer involvement. So with the introduction of the focused review format, this brought these two new mandatory sections to Cochrane Reviews. And we'll start with equity first. The intervention review template includes reporting guidance for equity-related assessments and considerations. All Cochrane protocols should state whether the review will consider equity, and if not, provide a rationale why. Additional reporting guidance for the protocol focuses on defining populations who experience health inequity with respect to the condition, problem, or intervention of interest, and specifying methods for conducting any equity-related assessments. In the gray banner below, we can see a few additional resources authors can access for this section. There is an MSU web clinic with information on including equity in Cochrane Reviews. Additionally, tutorials will be available in the Cochrane Evidence Synthesis and Methods Journal to help authors consider equity in their reviews. On the next couple of slides, we have some examples that were suggested by the Equity Thematic Group. So here's an example of an equity-related assessment section of a protocol by Varela and colleagues. I'll highlight some key characteristics. The authors provide first a rationale for equity considerations specific to their variables of interest, in this case, sex and residential location. The authors also tell us their methods for conducting the equity-related assessment and how their assessment will be presented or add context to their findings. And finally, the authors opted to use a supplemental table as part of their equity considerations. The table describes the population authors expected to see in the evidence, and after conducting the review, the actual representation authors observed in the included studies. A template for this table is available in the supplementary files of the intervention review template. Here's another example of reporting methods for the equity-related assessment section in a protocol by Olson and colleagues. Again, authors provide a clear rationale for looking at specific equity-related factors, such as socioeconomic status, sex, and race. Authors also describe the data they'll collect, in this case, relevant Progress Plus characteristics. And finally, authors also describe how they plan to conduct their assessment, in this case, descriptively, also highlighting and presenting differences in the baseline risks in the summary of findings tables, and possibly conducting subgroup analyses. All protocols should also include a section on consumer involvement. Now, we're using the term consumer involvement here because in this context, consumers includes patients and members of the public, as well as policymakers, researchers, health professionals, and more. The intervention review template provides guidance for reporting planned consumer involvement, as we can see in the highlighted blue box. But this also includes a supplementary file in which authors can organize relevant information. For example, who's involved and why, as well as how they were being involved in different aspects of the review. The template also includes example text if authors are not including consumer involvement. In the gray box on the bottom left, there are some additional resources specific to methods that might be helpful for this section. So in the next couple of slides, we have some examples suggested by the co-production methods group. Similar to the examples for the equity section, I'll highlight some notable areas. Now, this is a small portion of an appendix describing involvement for a review update. And in each of these sections of this example, we can see that the authors explained the aim of involvement regarding different aspects of the review, who was involved, in this case, stroke survivors, carers, and physiotherapists, and the mode of involvement or how they were involved. For example, authors reported using a series of online meetings, emails, webinars, and telephone calls for engagement. Here's a second example, this one by Tanner and colleagues. In this example, authors again describe who was involved. Again, in this case, clinicians, patients, patient representatives, and other key individuals. Authors also describe the level of involvement using the active framework and how they were involved and stage of review process for involvement. In this case, using an online survey to request feedback with no direct interaction. So to summarize, protocol development is a required and critical component of Cochrane Systematic Reviews. It ensures thoughtful planning ahead of review conduct. Protocol development, peer review, and publication helps reduce bias and improves transparency and accountability. There are several resources to help authors in developing their protocols, and authors can avoid some of the common errors seen when reviewing protocols by clearly describing interventions, comparators, and outcomes of interest, clearly describing the assessment of risk of bias methods, and prioritizing comparisons and outcomes for summary of findings tables. Authors should also please be sure to include sections on equity and consumer involvement. And we wanted to wrap up by encouraging everyone to stay informed. Be sure you're signed up for the Author Digest by going into your Cochrane account, going to the Communications tab, and clicking on the optional digests. This monthly newsletter includes important information for Cochrane authors as well as top tips. Also, thanks to the hard work of the Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group and the Prognosis Methods Group, new templates for qualitative evidence synthesis and prognosis reviews are in the works. They're not available yet, but when they are, they will likely sit in the same location as the current intervention review template. And here's a list of our references.